Hello, everyone. Welcome. The FLEF Talkback series is produced in collaboration with Cinemapolis, Ithaca's nonprofit, first-run movie theater, which specializes in independent, foreign, and locally produced films. Welcome to our Talkback. I'm Leah Schaefer, associate producer for the FLEF Talkbacks. Cinemapolis, which has been a FLEF partner for 20 years, has a mission of encouraging Central New York residents to explore the power of film to entertain, educate, and to celebrate the human experience. This year, they're screening 25 films for us using the Eventive platform. Pre-pandemic, Cinemapolis hosted embodied screenings for the festival, and Cinemapolis has been a critical partner in facilitating the pivot to remote screenings. This year, Cinemapolis is hosting both remote and live events for FLEF. You can find them online at cinemapolis.org. Before we transition to our FLEF welcome, we would like to share with you a trailer for the film we'll be discussing today.
I hate to say this, but my chances of coming home are so slim.
You can't wrap your brain around life with no parole for 50 years. You just can't.
Since I'm 30, I'm the first grandson. I've never known her outside of prison.
The prosecution's theory was that she was the only one that could have committed the offense in the house that night.
Would I lie and say that I killed my husband so that I could go home to them? Oh, that is the hardest question ever.
If she did not take the rifle to the pond, who did?
It's been a long time since I've read The Scarlet Letter, but they painted Patty as a scarlet woman.
To me, it's a classic case of tunnel vision.
We're not surprised when men commit crimes, but we are totally surprised when women commit crimes.
Are we a warehouse state or are we a rehabilitation state?
Regardless to how long she's been there, she still has that spark, that drive to live, that joy.
Patty was my mom when I didn't have one.
Occasionally I'll think, she's gonna die there. Then I just shut it down. I'm just like, nope, that's not the ending that we're gonna have a happy ending.
All we have left is a governor.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 25th anniversary edition of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. We remind ourselves that we are running this festival as climate catastrophes multiply and intensify, when over 6 million people worldwide have died from COVID, and when the people of Ukraine are fighting the brutal Russian invasion. For all of us at FLEF, the world is our why. I'm Rachel Schaff, assistant to the director of FLEF. Major sponsors for FLEF include the Park Foundation and Ithaca College. Our festival theme this year is entanglements, a concept that explores how different environments, ideas, imaginaries, places, politics, practices, registers, and species twist into each other in a mesh. We are all very honored that you have joined us today for the Cinemapolis Talkback for the film 33 and Counting. Please rename yourself with your physical location after your name. Our speakers will discuss the film for 30 minutes. Then we will open the floor to your questions. It is with great pleasure that I now introduce Aisha Sultan, Director of 33 and Counting, and Raza Rumi, Director of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for your introduction to FLEF, and it's a true pleasure to be working once again this year with the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, which brings together so many ideas, as you mentioned in your intro, and I'm even more delighted to have Aisha Sultan, whom I've known for many years now. And I first met her, and Aisha has been reinventing herself. We met. I mean, I know she's a very good journalist based in St. Louis, Missouri, but of late she has transitioned as well as a filmmaker. And so, before we talk about 33 and Counting and other people, I would like to bring in that film as well, because that kind of speaks to us all South Asians. I would like you to briefly tell us, Aisha, about your journey, from a very pure strict print journalist into this wider filmmaking arena, screenwriting. I mean, so many other aspects which come along while you're making films.
Well, it's wonderful to see you, Raza. Thank you for bringing me and my work here. It means a great deal to me. I have so much respect for you and the work that you do. And thank you to the organizers and the people who pull off projects and festivals like this. It's really the lifeblood for artists to be able to share their work with an audience. And it's greatly appreciated. So I have worked as a journalist for more than 25 years, primarily as a print journalist, and I never took a single journalism class in college or in graduate school. So for any students who are watching, let me just reassure you that you don't necessarily have to have a journalism degree to work or have a platform as a journalist. However, that said, I've only ever worked in newsrooms for my entire career in print newsrooms. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which is the largest daily newspaper in St. Louis, Missouri. We recently won Pulitzer Prize for our photography and coverage of Ferguson, the unrest in Ferguson, and we had our Metro columnist win a Pulitzer Prize a couple of years ago. And so it's a storied institution founded by the Pulitzer family. And I've learned, I was a beat reporter, a news reporter for 10 years, and then I became a columnist for the past 13 years, where, as you know, I share my opinion and analysis and the way I see the world and the problems in the world. And as part of that, I also served on the editorial board for a while, which is when you write the unsigned positions of the paper as part of a group that debates those. So while I no longer do that, but while I was doing that, I was intrigued and really taken by this notion of clemency and in which cases states and governors use clemency to right wrongs. Wrongful incarceration, people who should no longer be in prison, doesn't serve society, and states where it doesn't happen, and how infrequently it is used for the cases of women. And so I worked with a law professor who had a clemency clinic at St. Louis University Law School. I read dozens and dozens of petitions, and I picked 5 that were very compelling to me. And of those 5, Patty Pruitt, who is now, by the end of this month, will have served 36 years in prison. She's now 72 years old, the oldest woman incarcerated in the state of Missouri. Her story was so compelling to me that I wanted to make a documentary about it, which is what I did.
Yes, indeed. And I come straight to 33 and counting, This is such a heart-wrenching story. And, not only that it exposes the faults and flaws of the justice system, but also issues of gender, issues of class in a way, because, all these intersect. I know the term class is not very widely used in America. Everybody gets a jitter when you say class because it's like the old commie scare. But tell us a little bit about Patty's, when you were making this film, obviously you did a lot of research, it shows in film, interviews. So for our viewers, and some of them may wish to go and see 33 and counting right after this talkback. Tell us a bit about 33 and counting. What is the most striking part to you as an artist, as a filmmaker, as a screenwriter that gripped your imagination?
Okay, so first I want to say, for people who haven't had an opportunity to see it yet, there is very graciously a free screening available through the festival until midnight tonight. And the link is included in the chat. And I will also, and Reza and I will also share the link later, so that please watch it, please respond to it, and share your feedback with me after you've had a chance to see it. So I wanted everybody who's here to know that you will have an opportunity to see the film for free until midnight tonight. Okay, so what gripped me about Patty's story? She was from a small town, a small rural town in the middle of Missouri. They had pretty decent stature. Like, she was the head of the Chamber of Commerce. They had their own business there. She and her husband, they had 5 kids. So, she's an attractive white woman. And when her husband was killed, as many times when a spouse is killed, the suspicion immediately goes on the spouse, on the surviving partner. In her case, there were so many egregious shortcomings in how that investigation was handled. Like, No fingerprints were taken. No other very legitimate suspects were even, pursued as a serious lead. They had this sort of tunnel vision, focused on Patty, and did whatever they could to build a case around her. And why? Why was she such a prime suspect? Because she had had an affair. She had admitted to affairs previously in her marriage. So then there was this issue of like, oh, well, if she's capable of that, as if no men have ever had affairs and, certainly don't get life sentences in prison because of it, then she must be capable of anything. And that was the predominant mentality of all the men who pursued this case and pursued justice in this case at that time, 30, almost 40 years ago now, right? And then she naively, from a small rural town, believed that if I just tell the truth, then I will be exonerated. And frankly, there are people for whom that can work, but there are plenty of people in prison right now for whom that has not been a successful strategy, right? And so what gripped me about this film is not just the sexist double standard that came in the investigation and the prosecution of this case, but also the fact that nobody ever talked about her 5 surviving children who had lost their father and now lost their mother. And the oldest, Jane, who's the primary character in my film, was 16. And these kids are left to fend for themselves in the world.
Wow.
Absolutely. And so what
Absolutely.
becomes of children when a mother is incarcerated? And so then the film really became this larger project of, did you know that the rates of female incarceration in this country since the 80s have skyrocketed by hundreds of %? Like, I didn't know that. I had no idea that in America, we had a policy shift in our incarceration policy where mothers were being incarcerated at a higher rate than any other demographic in this country, like percentage-wise, the rate of increase that you would see. And that really shocked me because when you incarcerate a mother, you're incarcerating that entire family, the children that are left behind, because they're all often the primary caregivers. And so then what happens to those children in that family? So what compelled me so much about this case was her daughter, Jane, who was left behind.
Yeah, thank you, Aisha. Yeah, it is indeed a very moving account. And, I'm also curious to know, because you use a lot of footage and you use, interviews. And so about the technique, I'm also interested in that. I mean, how did you plan that? Because you were the screenwriter, right?
Right, right. Yeah. Yes. And so this was my first documentary. And like you said, I was a print journalist. I really, how I became a filmmaker? I Googled how to make an independent film. Okay. And I read everything I could on Google. And I talked to a ton of people who had made films and people who I know had made independent films. And I went around and begged organizations and wealthy people to fund my little project because I had no money. I didn't really know what I was doing, frankly, but I knew when when a story gripped me and compelled me. Like, I know that because I've been working as a journalist for a long time. And I knew when there was something of value in it for the rest of the world to see. So I basically had to just teach myself this process. And you're right. I feel like a documentary is not super compelling if it's just a series of talking heads. But if you're recounting something that happened 30, 40 years ago, how do you get past that? Well, we had 2 lucky breaks in this film. One, Patty's daughter, Jane, really opened her heart and her life to us and allowed us to accompany her on a visit to her mother. So that gave us a narrative structure that we are along with this adult daughter now visiting her mother in prison. The other lucky break we had is that we were able to get all the crime scene footage that the police had taken from the event after they showed up to investigate. And so between those 2 things, we were able to hang this narrative of flashing back to that crime scene and Patty telling what she believes happened in her words, and the current prosecutor talking about why haven't we allowed DNA testing in this case when DNA testing is available and could possibly exonerate her. We were able to draw in these different competing voices and law professors saying, why do women get harsher sentences in cases like this? Or why aren't they considered for clemency in cases like this? What are our societal attitudes about this? Is Patty serving a life sentence for committing adultery? Is the purpose of justice furthered by this woman dying in prison? And I would argue, whether you completely are convinced of her innocence or not by the end of this film, that justice is not furthered by Patty remaining in prison.
Yeah, yeah. And, I mean, I hate drawing comparisons, but, I'm, as you know, from Pakistan originally, and in our sort of countries which are known as less developed or underdeveloped or whatever, we have all these cases about, this gender bias, clear, misogynistic justice system. But, your film was an eye-opener when I actually got that link, and I'm like, wow, this is happening in America, that adultery or an affair could lead a woman for a lifelong sentence in prison, and in the US. And, so it's, in a way, I mean, for me, it's a double
Reza, I have to tell you, it's so interesting you should say that, because back when I was making this film 3 years ago, I was hosting a group of journalists who, on this program, this like the State Department program, where they come to St. Louis for a week, and I showed them the trailer for the film, and I talked to them. There's like a group of 12 journalists from Pakistan, and every single one of them said, this is a Pakistani story. This is what happens in Pakistan. We're so surprised that the same thing happens in America. And I was like, oh, yes, indeed. Like what you imagine our justice system to be, there are many examples of failure. There are many examples of failure of the system, but they said the exact same thing that you just said.
Yeah, because that was my reaction. The first reaction, I'm like, OMG, this is happening in the US. And obviously, which is then, I mean, of course, by now we know the number of incarcerated people in the US is perhaps highest in the world, 2.2 million upwards, right?
Right.
And then if you're poor, if you are from this, small town, unknown place, if you are a person of color,
right.
Right.
There are a lot of things that are stacked against you if you have no experience with the criminal justice system, if you're naive about how it operates, if you think you can just tell the truth and everything will be fine. Well, there might be some shocks for you when you have your first encounter with the criminal justice system. And the other piece that really pulled at my heart as a mother, I have 2 children myself in this story, is this bond that Patty maintained with her children behind bars. They have visited her every month for now almost 36 years, as long as visitors have been allowed. They weren't allowed during COVID. But imagine the strength of that maternal bond and the love, and none of her children believe that their mother killed their father. And they all want her out. And they have pleaded and fought for her and advocated for her. And that was one thing. And the other thing is that in prison, what Patty has been able to do, like the worst things that you can imagine to a person have happened to her. Her husband was killed. She said the man who broke into her house, an intruder, raped her and murdered her husband in front of her. While she was in prison, tragic things happened to her family. She was wrongly convicted of this. Like the most horrible things that can happen to a person happened to her. And yet she has managed to hold on to hope and inspire people and change so many women's lives in prison. And, that's just kind of an extraordinary human being right there.
Yes. And Aisha, I mean, of course, this is a very instrumental question, but obviously it's an investigative journalism piece as well. Right. So what would you say has been the impact? How was it received by local officials, the state authorities, justice groups, women's groups? So let's hear about that real impact of a documentary.
Right. So the one unfortunate piece of what happened with this documentary is that, first of all, it was very well critically received, but it was accepted into a film festival in New York, and it was meant to premiere in New York in March of 2020. Well, do you know what else happened in March of 2020? Yeah. The country shut down. So unlike my first film, which we will also talk about, other people, which had it screened in so many theaters around the country. I saw it with audiences. All of the screening for 33 and counting has been virtual because of the pandemic, which has really broken my heart because there's something very special about sharing a film with an audience in a cinema. And also it sort of just touches people in a different way. But that said, we were able to get a screening on our local PBS channel, which has huge reach in our area,
Okay,
our
okay.
PBS affiliate. And there have been people from around the country that have reached out to the governor's office, that have written letters and emails in support and editorials, and it's gotten press coverage, extraordinary amount of press coverage that that Patty deserves clemency, that don't let this woman die in prison. And so I'm hopeful that now that as some of the pandemic restrictions are winding down, that we will be able to have some theatrical screenings and galvanize some more momentum and have a screening for lawmakers. Because another thing I say in the film is there's really a bipartisan group of lawmakers who do not want Patty in prison any longer. And if we could kind of convene them in a time when we're so polarized on an issue to say, hey, here's like one person's life and one family that's been traumatized by the justice system who we can help. Like, let's try to make that a bipartisan thing we can do.
Thank you. Yeah. So let's move to your other film, The Other People. And for ladies and gentlemen and all those who are present here, Aisha's very short film, Other People, is about, South Asian dilemmas, or for that matter, any other non-white community, which is, so where are you from? Where are you actually from? So tell us a bit about that film and how did that trigger, for those, and because I'm sure there will be many who will watch it. It's a very short film.
Yeah, it's 9 minutes long, right? So it's actually the first film I made, and it's different than a documentary because I actually wrote a script. It's a narrative. It's all make-believe, came up, it's a story I made up in my head. Of course, informed by life experiences that I've had, but like I made up the characters. It's all fiction. And it was funny to do this as a journalist for my first film to be a narrative, because I literally, I knew how to write a screenplay, or I had some idea of it, but I did not know how to take that and actually make a movie out of it. So of course, Google again came in very handy, but I made that film shortly after the election of Donald Trump. And as someone who was born and raised in America, as a non-white person, as a Muslim, as a brown woman, as a journalist, I felt more displaced in this country after that election than I ever have in my entire life. And there have been moments when I felt very displaced in my country. And in a way that I could not, through my column or my writing, hold up the mirror, that I wanted people to feel the uncomfortable and the awkwardness and the anxiety that I felt. So I wanted to create a piece of work, a short little vignette, really, that made people feel uncomfortable and awkward. And I think that's the overwhelming feeling as you watch it. It's like one awkward scene after another that this brown Pakistani man has with a bunch of white women, affluent white women, in this social setting, which is a child's birthday party. And there's no neat or tidy resolution to it, because I feel like there's no neat and tidy resolution in our country to this sort of ongoing question of how people of color find our place and how we negotiate predominantly white spaces. But how did you feel as a Pakistani man watching it? Did you feel awkward and uncomfortable?
Totally. Aisha, look, you have a great American accent. You are much whiter than I am. So imagine me being at the other end of the spectrum. But yes, I felt very awkward. And I think the film personally spoke to me. There are great things about the US. I will start with that disclaimer before anyone thinks that, I'm being this negative type. So not at all. But I think this issue, and as you rightly mentioned, this watershed moment, Trump's election in 2016. I know people say it had been coming, it had been brewing, and racism is a structural issue. Yes, we know all of that. But to give that sort of venue and platform to a man who is unashamedly racist is what has been the marker of our times, And I just feel that, I have been asked these questions. How come your English is so good? Where do they teach you in English in Pakistan? Your English is good, but your accent is a bit, so I get all these responses. And as I was watching your film, and I thought that, let's turn around the narrative and see, how would the other characters feel if they had to undergo the same kind of rigorous questioning? You know what I mean?
Right. And, there's been a lot of conversation about the impact and should we even talk about what are called microaggressions when there are major aggressions, like, when there's police brutality and there's people who are incarcerated because of the color of, their skin is is a exacerbating factor in that. So what is there any value in talking about microaggressions? Well, I would argue, obviously I made a film about it, that there is value in having people experience and feel something, right? Which might be different for someone. People experience and consume art differently. So perhaps there's some people who will watch this and have a feeling of discomfort and have maybe an increased awareness or empathy about what it feels to be consistently be put in that position of awkwardness or discomfort your entire life, right? In a place that is home for you, in a place that has given you many opportunities that you're grateful for and that you always have to continuously prove yourself worthy of, okay? But let me just say that it was just an exercise, hopefully an effective one, in building empathy. And also, that's kind of what this Patty's story was too, to try to draw that back, is I had never met or befriended or gotten to know someone who's been convicted of murder. I'd never stepped foot into a prison before I made that film. I had my own preconceptions, I'm sure, of what happens to families when people are incarcerated. But until you get to know and care about and spend time with and see the humanity.
Yes, Aisha, that's great. And I would like to follow this up, with your personal experience, if you're comfortable sharing that. I mean, I remember that you wrote a column which, invoked the ire of many a reader. And then you got all these online vile comments and attacks, etc. So if you're comfortable, just say a little bit about that, because that kind of puts you in the larger context of the filmmaker, journalist, and this, American of South Asian descent.
Thank you for asking that, Reza. Thank you for asking that question. I appreciate that. Right. So I have worked, like I said, my entire career as a public writer. And if you work as a journalist in this country, especially in this moment, you have to have a thick skin. Clearly you do. But I would say that in the past, since 2015, I would say since the rise of Trumpism, any criticism, we get a lot of criticism. People disagree with us. And that's part of this whole project of democracy, is people should be able to disagree with you, even very strongly. That what has happened is that now disagreements and attacks that I get, whether it's email, phone calls, lectures, a million ways people can reach you on social media, have markedly increased in the racist and sexist tinge or outright attack that goes with it. And sometimes it's, very aggressive, very vulgar, disgusting, and sometimes if you write something that really provokes people, which as a writer, as an opinion writer, you do want to provoke people to think, to see your perspective, it can cause an avalanche sometimes of that kind of, and especially if you're a woman on social media, if you're a brown Muslim woman on social media, writing things against white supremacists and, Republican actions and writing about reproductive freedom and writing about these things, you're inviting some level of abuse, right? So I will say that having times in my life when I have felt diminished, when people have tried to silence me or diminish me and refuse to see my own humanity, makes me much more drawn to stories in which other people are being diminished and their humanity is not being seen. And those are the stories that I want to tell.
Yes, exactly. Because your short film, Other People, is all about the otherness, and otherness, as you know, is a subject of so much research and writing, etc. So say a bit about that. After that film, how was it received? Did
Oh,
people get the point in St. Louis or elsewhere, wherever you showed the film?
Right. So I did show the film in many places. And you know what? I will say that I feel like there's this bias, like, oh, you're in the Midwest, like you should. And even in St. Louis, like my friends, I live in the county, and which is a more conservative area, you know, more Republican area. And my friends in the city, which is more liberal area. Oh, that's what happens when you live in places like that. No, no, ma'am, no, sir. That's sort of like assumption that someone who is different from you is not as American as you is widespread in all corners of like the coast and in the middle of the country. And so when I did screen this film, and I went to a lot of college campuses and I showed it, there was some pushback from people who felt like, well, that's not really fair because it feels like in the film you're portraying all white people a certain way, or that you hate white people. I said, absolutely not. Like, I'm married to a man whose mother is white, and my, you know, I mean, this, first of all, that's absolutely not the point of the film. But imagine how that might feel for someone who's only seen people who look like them portrayed a certain way in media. Like, here's a 9-minute short, an independent 9-minute short that made you feel like, oh, this, because there is no white hero or white savior in this film, that she must hate all white people, which is not true at all. Imagine how, you know, nearly, 45 years of consuming media that largely has portrayed people who are brown, who are Muslim, a certain way, would make you think about the way the culture and the society values your place in the country.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm saying this because I underwent a similar experience, some years ago when Donald Trump was still the president. I was invited to speak in Washington, D.C. about the state of media freedoms across the globe. Right. And of course, I spoke about X and Y and, other countries. And then I made the mistake of also mentioning Mr. Trump, saying that, he doesn't like the media very much, and he's been threatening the CNN, etc. And of course, I mean, I got a little bit of pushback, but the organizer wrote a long email to me, which I've saved for posterity, saying, you were not supposed to raise this issue. This was about the globe. I mean, and it was not about America. I mean, so I was like, isn't America part of the international community? Isn't the US, leading? So you get all these strange kind of reactions. But anyway, I won't go into further detail. But one last question, and then we should open it up for the audience. We still have a few hands. I just want to also get a sense from you how different it is, because you've been a feature writer as well. Right. You're now a columnist. You've been a news reporter. Right. You've done it. So how different is this process of indie filmmaking and writing than other, work that you've been doing? I mean, because there's some students and they would like to, hear this.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I can report on a story, a feature story or a column entirely myself, and then craft it the way that I want to tell it, and then pass it on to editors and copy editors who might have questions. And then it appears in the paper in a relatively short amount of time. Well, my column appears every week, but a feature story might appear, after a couple of weeks of working on it. But a film is far more collaborative, and you really cannot make it in isolation. And you have to have a team of people around you who have skills that, like, I need to have a person who knows how to operate a camera, who knows how to cut film, who knows how to work sound. And I had to learn who are all these necessary people that you need on a project like this, who have technical skills. Even if you have an idea, if you know how to interview people, if you know how to identify a story, if you know how to structure a story, there's a lot that you don't know how to do or you're not an expert at. And so for me, at least, it was very important for me to be able to pay these people. So a big part of independent filmmaking for me is constantly writing grants or trying to find funds so that I can pay people who are going to work on these films with me to do them. And so, like, this weekend, I have a budget to I'm writing 3 grants right now to film my current documentary that I'm working on, which is about how the pandemic has disrupted education for young kids, the youngest kids in the most impoverished school districts. So, and you write these long grants and you have to give budget proposals. And these are not things that I really ever had to do as a journalist. but I have to learn how to do as somebody who wants to make films, and it's not fun. It's terrible. And a lot of times, most of the time you get rejected or you don't get the funding you want, which is very disheartening. So yeah, I don't mean to be discouraging, but I just want to give sort of like a realistic picture of what it's like to make an independent film. Like, it's hard work, and it has to be something that you're so passionate about, a story that you just feel so compelled about that it has to be told.
Yes, great, Aisha. I have a long list, but I'll stop here. Professor Stewart Ayush is with us, and he has a question. So over to you, Stewart.
Thank you, Raza. And Aisha, I love your film. Thank you, both of them, actually. I think you already answered my question, but I want to ask it anyway. But in the short film, I think you made an amazing shift by having the father go to the party. And I think that worked perfectly. But can you explain your thinking behind that and
right,
and why you decided to make that decision? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the film, the premise is that there's an interracial couple, a white woman who's married to a Pakistani man, and their child, biracial child, is invited to a party at a very nice, like affluent white neighborhood where the mother makes a comment that makes the white mother feel very uncomfortable at a play date. And so then the white mother says, I don't want my daughter to go and be around people who say stupid things like that, say bigoted things like that. And the father says, if I was going to boycott anytime someone gave me a sideways look or made some kind of, off-color remark, I would never leave my house. Like, this is, and for me, like, I wanted to show that this white woman can feel very outraged and want to protect her child and her family, but because she's able to do that, because it is unusual for her to see and experience this. But for people who walk around in black and brown skin in this country, like, you have to find ways to deal with it and negotiate this. And that's why I wanted the father to be like, no, I want my daughter to have this experience. And if I have to feel some discomfort in the process, I will. And I'm sorry you're so outraged, but my life doesn't allow me to be so outraged that I can just sit it out.
Right. That's a great response. Stuart, any follow-up you have?
No, thank you. I'll have another question about the other film later on.
Okay, Leah.
My question is about 33 and counting, and I would love to hear a little bit about the ways that you were forced to cooperate with the correctional facility and how it worked for you to navigate moving in and out of that space as part of your filmmaking work.
That's a great question. And that's something that's not apparent if you watch the film. So I'm really glad you asked that. And only someone who's actually been to a prison would know to even ask that question, or is very familiar with the incarcerational state. So what happens is you have to go through layers of bureaucracy to get permission to be able to enter a prison with a camera to interview somebody. So, and it just so happened at the time there was a warden, the director of the entire prison system was very supportive of Patty, had friends there and people there who also have seen the remarkable difference she's made in prison and were willing to let us come in. So first we had to, send emails and get permission. And then you have to turn in your copies of your driver's licenses. They run background checks on you and the crew that you're going to come with. You have to send lists of whatever equipment you're going to bring in with you. And then you have very strict parameters as to where and how you can film. And when you go in, like, you can't bring a cell phone with you. You can't, I was wearing these hoop earrings. I had to take them off. Like, you can't wear earrings. Like, there's very strict rules about what you can bring inside with you when you go inside a prison. And you don't realize that, and you get the whole screening, pat down everything. They look at your equipment. And then when you're in there, you only get a certain set amount of time. And I was fortunate that I was able to go back more than once. But the only reason I was able to make this film is because I had that kind of access. And because in that prison system, there are people who work there who really support this woman. Now, in a prison system where they're not friendly to the person that you want to make the film to, you'll never hear their story and this told in this way.
Right. Great. So let's see if there are other questions or comments. Feel free to put them in chat or raise your hand. Okay, yes, Justin Foster, FLEF Fellow.
Yes, I just want to say, first of all, that I love the film and very inspiring to a young Black filmmaker. And I guess my question would be, so you brought up how there's this exponential rise in mothers being incarcerated.
Right.
And obviously we know the impact of that from mothers being separated from their children outside of prison. But I'm curious if you encountered the idea of mothers who are pregnant going into prison and have to give birth in prison, and what that looks like and how that has further implications.
Yeah, no, that is something that deserves and has been written about and deserves films in its own right, because it's really inhumane. I mean, there are women in prison who've had to give birth in shackles and been separated from their babies immediately after giving birth. It is completely dehumanizing. And there have been movements towards trying to reform like the worst of that. So I will say, even in the state of Missouri, there was recently legislation that allowed there to be a way for women to like breastfeed and be with their infants after they've given birth. But I feel like the larger question behind this issue is why are we incarcerating so many women and mothers? And I'll tell you why. It's because of our failed war on drugs in this country, in which we have locked up addicts instead of giving them rehab, access to medical treatment to help them with drug addictions. And that's primarily why you've seen the number of cases of mothers in prison skyrocket, because of drugs and our failed war on drugs.
Yeah.
I mean, and that really becomes a policy question then. Is it in the best interest of the state to lock up mothers who are drug addicts? Does that yield like the best results for society? I would argue no.
Thank you. Okay, Abdul Nader, it's your turn. Your question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Raza, for letting me ask the question. So I think, being a print journalist, I think when you write things, they only go so far. But I think there is a lot of power in the film. And I really congratulate Miss Aisha, I don't know her last name actually.
Sultan, that's fine.
Nozhat, for making these two documentaries that I have not seen, but I'll definitely see them. And I think you obviously felt very passionate about these topics, and that is why you made them.
Yeah.
And you told us that you Googled and you figured out how to make it, and then you hired the right people.
Yes.
So my question is that if you make a 30-minute documentary, what kind of a budget you are looking for, and how can you recover that budget or film it so that you can use that for future projects like you're already thinking about? Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and one that I wish I had asked when I started this whole endeavor. So to just be very frank and transparent about my budget for the 9-minute narrative short that I made, in which I had to hire actors and we had a cast and crew of 50 people for a 9-minute short. That budget totally was probably around $18,000. And I got a lot. So what I did is I partnered with a nonprofit that act as my fiscal sponsor, which means that people could make donations to a fiscal sponsor that was a nonprofit. So it was a tax deduction for them. And a lot of grants that you apply for, they give money to nonprofits. So you can't just apply, like most places, you can't just apply and say, hi, I'm Aisha Sultan, I would like some money. Like they want to see how is it going to be spent? What's, who's overseeing this whole thing? So, so what I did is in that case, I was able to, and then I put in, I never paid myself to work on any of the films. I did pay everybody else who worked on it. And I applied for in journalistic grants, film grants, humanity council grants. I appealed to people who I knew who had foundations who cared about issues of race and, or when it was Patty's film, issues of wrongful incarceration. I had to Google and find all those organizations, make connections with people. Now, it helped that I had a 25-year journalistic standing in this community. So people knew I was a serious person doing serious work. So they would take my calls and take my meetings. And I could say to them, this is why I think this is a project worthy of $5,000 or $1,000 or whatever, you know, but it was a matter of like collecting small amounts of money here and there. Now, how did I recoup any of that money? With the first film, other people, because it's 9 minutes, I was able to set, and because a lot of colleges and universities and places want to have conversations about diversity and inclusion, but don't know how to, or oftentimes like don't know how to engage their like people in a way to have like an honest and sometimes difficult conversation. I reached out to many people and said, hey, I can come show this film. I can talk about it for like 5 minutes. I can moderate a panel with people from within your organization to talk about their own experiences. And then we can do a conversation that's like an hour-long program. I can promise that something very rich and valuable that will improve the culture of your organization will come out of this, or thought-provoking. And so I did that for like 12 different places, like around the country. People who knew me, who knew my work, brought me in, and they might pay, like, if it's a small organization, $500. If it's a large university, they might pay $5,000, you know? And so I was able to recover some of that money that helped fund the next film. So with 33 and Counting, I did do a fundraiser on Facebook for like $3,000. I did reach out to people who I knew cared about wrongful incarceration and prison reform. And I reached out to, and then I applied for like journalistic grants because this was a journalistic film. And I was able to, so that film cost probably around $20,000. Now, I was not able to recoup any of that money because any speaking I might have done or screening I might have done was shut down because of the pandemic. And so when it screens at film festivals or on PBS, you don't get paid for that. So that was, I mean, but I just cared about that story, you know, and the reason I'm able to do it is because I have a full-time job writing, you know, as my day job. So I'm able to still support myself and my family. For the third film I'm working on, so I think you have to be kind of, and then the films that get shortlisted for like the Academy Awards that are short films, they sometimes have budgets of $100,000, $200,000. I've been to a lot of festivals. I've seen a lot of really well-made films. And if you just look at the credits afterwards, you can see the number of people that worked on them and the places that, I mean, those films tend to have very, very large budgets, and they have supporters. It's hard to get distribution for a short film. Like, I could put it on Amazon and charge people, you know, they have to pay me whatever to watch it, but I kind of prefer making it accessible to people through film festivals. So that, I don't know, maybe one day I will do that.
Thank you. Aisha, I have another question by Muna Habib, who's also, she is writing from New Mexico. So you have quite a wide fan base. So she says, what challenges did you come up with during your film 33 and Counting? Was there ever a time when sources became nervous and wanted to stop the film?
Oh, Mona, there were times when I just threw my hands up and I thought, this is never going to get made. And actually that happened to me in every film I've made so far. I've had a moment where I'm just like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? This is never going to come to fruition. This is a total disaster and everything's falling apart. And not just sources, but like sometimes funding doesn't come through that you're counting on. Sometimes equipment fails, but sometimes you don't get the, you know, I mean, when you're producing, like normally there's a producer who handles all those logistics, or many producers, but when you're the director, writer, producer, you're like dealing with a lot of logistical issues and putting out fires and the money, trying to handle the money and raise money, and then also have the creative vision of it. So it can be kind of all consuming. I know even there are times when I'm like deep in production or deep in post-production where it's like, I can't even focus on what's going on with my family, and I don't cook dinner for weeks or months, or I mean, really weeks, I would say, because I'm so consumed with the work that I'm doing. And that's kind of yeah, no, honestly, I can't remember like off the top of my mind, but I know there were several times when I would reach out to like a mentor or somebody and I'd say, I don't think this is going to happen. I think this is just like, I've just been spinning my wheels. I think it's a disaster. And those are the moments where like somebody who's got more experience will reassure you and say, no, everybody hits this wall. It's very common, you know, and they help you with creative workarounds, and you make do. Like the audience doesn't know what better footage you could have had or what better scene you might have had. They just know what you're giving them.
Great. That's a great response. I hope, Muna, you've got your notes ready. So we just have 4 minutes left, and I invite the audience, if they have a comment or a question or a follow-up question, feel free. I mean, you don't have to have a question. You can respond to what Aisha said if you agree with her or don't agree with her. Okay, Abdul Nader has raised his hand again. Abdul Nader is up, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I apologize for taking time, but I just wanted to ask, how did you recruit your team? Because obviously it's not easy to find people. There are a bunch of them out there, but to find the right people, and there's so many of them, like you said. So if you could please expand on that. Thank you.
Right. So I felt like, well, first I reached out to people who I knew were sort of crazy like me and also willing to put work on passion projects. You know, there are certain people who have the time and the bandwidth to be able to do that, and other people who, because of other things going on, they just don't. And also I asked for a lot of referrals. I asked the director of our St. Louis Film Festival, who are the best cinematographers that you know in town? Who are the ones that will work for a reduced rate on like this type of project? Who are people that you would recommend? And I asked like everyone who I worked with ever who was good at what they were doing, I would ask them for referrals. And then I know a lot of people because I've worked as a journalist in this town for 20 plus years. So, and then the other thing I did is very transparent and upfront with people who were coming on board that I'm not gonna be able to pay you your normal day rate, or I'm not gonna probably be able to pay you what you would get paid on a commercial project, because this is like a one woman operation. And my budget is small, but this is why I care so much about this project. And so I think the people, when I told them why I cared and why this story was important, the ones who it touched and they also felt like it was important, then they're all in, right? Like once you tell a story to someone and that story hooks them and they're very good at what they do, then they're like, okay, I care about this story too, and I want to help you. Or I like how you feel about this story. I like your passion about it. And I think when we try to convince anyone to support our work, it's being able to translate that. That's really key to being able to successfully create something.
Great. Professor Monica Mehta, you are next. Aisha, Monica is a professor of film studies and lots of things. So your question, please.
Raza, thanks for that introduction. Aisha, I just wanted to tell you how much I loved watching both of your films, and I very much look forward to using them in class in the future. And with the other people, I was just struck by, in just such a short span of time, you were able to convey how otherness worked. And especially that moment in the film when two brown people are coming into the park, and the white woman starts speaking, saying, "Oh, the hijabi woman is necessarily oppressed by her husband." And of course, we find out a minute later that that's not the case at all. So I loved that intervention. I also love the fact that you had a South Asian man go to this clearly not only white party but white woman's party, right? So this was very much a gendered space, as was the park, where it was just white women and the kids, and so for him to enter both of these spaces that are largely female spaces, I thought was super interesting. One of the things that did come into my mind as I was watching it is I was wondering what would have happened if the South Asian man who came in didn't necessarily look like didn't have like a pant or shirt, but suppose he was wearing a salwar kameez. What would have happened at that point? Would that have made it difficult for him to navigate that space? Would he have only been seen as different at that point? Like, do you have to look like a certain kind of man to be liberal, right? Otherwise, you become unacceptable.
Right. I mean, I think any signifier that makes you stand out in a situation like that is going to be, the othering will be even more acute. Like, what if he'd had an accent? What if he, like Reza said, or what if he was clearly raised somewhere else? So what if he had been dressed differently? What if he wasn't like this little hipster dad, attractive? I mean, he was an attractive man. But yeah, and so as sort of like a function of story, I wanted to heighten the tension and the awkwardness for my character by inserting him in, like, it's sort of like that hero's journey where it's like they hit challenge after challenge and you want to heighten that so that the feeling for the audience is heightened. So it was like definitely a deliberate choice to have him be a fish out of water in as multiple ways as possible. But I also want to say thank you so much for your kind words, because I very much feel like an amateur, like I don't know what I'm doing. And so to hear someone who's an expert in film and like has, studied and knows film to say that they enjoyed the film really, feels very validating. And filmmaking is a collaborative effort and it's a great community, but it also, when you're an independent filmmaker, you kind of have to find your own support, let's say.
Yes,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Aisha. I think one of the things that I always try to tell my students, as I'm sure my colleagues do, is that precisely that film is a collaborative work, and there's so many people involved in this process. So I think having you say that is so important, I think, as a director, producer.
Thank you, Monica.
And Reza, let's remind everyone that they can see the film for free. They can see both films for free today. The links are in the chat, and then you and I will share the links also until midnight tonight. So please do go check them out if you hadn't had a chance to yet.
Well, thank you so much, Aisha. We have just 1 minute left. If you want to conclude or wrap up your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I will. I thank you for inviting me to share that. I will say that it can be discouraging and difficult as a storyteller in this country, in this moment in time, in the world. And this is when I feel like your voices, every single one of your voices, are valuable and more important than ever. And I just want to encourage any journalists, writers, poets, filmmakers who are listening and watching to say that if I can make a film, then certainly I believe that you can too.
Oh, that's a great message. Thank you so much, Aisha. And just as a reminder, I mean, the fact that you subvert the cliche about race, about identity, about color, I think that's the most fabulous part of your work. And obviously it comes with more than 2 decades of experience. I mean, thank God that there was nothing cliched about both the films. I mean, other than all the intellectual and technical merits. So on that note, let me thank everyone for being here, and Aisha, especially you, for taking out the time. Thanks.